Let's start off with a simple principle, which most of us have forgotten because we're both either parents or we were children at one point, and that is our physiological state influences our behavior. And we tend not to acknowledge that. We think that behavior is intentional. And we come at it literally in educational world and parenting worlds with literally a behavioral worldview that if you really want to be sit still and to listen and to process and be polite, you can. We tend not to understand that when our body gets into certain states, like states of threat, the only priority is our own survival. So we have to start understanding that basically, if the body shifts state, you better get. You want to get off that horse. So if it gets into a state of mobilization and aggressiveness, you're not going to make a contact through intentionality or through punishment. So polyvagal theory starts with this premise that in between the external world or stimulation or stimuli or cause and the body's response or the effects is our nervous system. And our nervous system can be in different states. It can be in this calm state where it supports health, growth, and restoration. It can be in a calm state where we're contemplative and we're thoughtful and we're generous and benevolent. Or it can be in literally a state of fight flight where we mobilize all our resources to protect ourselves, or in a state of literally overwhelming threat where we shut down and disappear literally within our own body and become numb.
hmm Yeah, so I think we are taught, when we think of psychology and the rise of behaviorism, that, a child does X, Y, and Z, that you add, either reinforcement or you add
Yeah.
punishment, and that the child has a choice. But ultimately, if the child is in a stress response, they've exited the logical
Mm.
part of their brain. So they're out
Yeah.
of their prefrontal cortex and they're in their sympathetic nervous system or parasympathetic,
Yeah.
depending. We won't get too
Yeah.
much into that,
Yeah.
but that they're in a state possibly of fight flight, where
Mm.
they're kind of, I think Mona Delahook calls it, that would be your red zone, where they're kind of in that state of protection where they want to exit, or they're going to get aggressive to protect themselves, or they're in that numbed out, shut down
Yeah.
response. But ultimately, it's all states of fear, protection, and
Yeah.
stress.
Then the anxiety just won't be there. So we have to understand that the psychological experience of anxiety is the brain's interpretation of a lower brainstem state of being in a state of threat, a foundational survival threat response.
Okay. So, with your theory, how do you, with polyvagal theory and looking at like the parasympathetic versus
Yeah.
sympathetic nervous system and the vagus, the vagus
Yeah.
nerve, all of those pieces, how do you think this changes the paradigm in which we parent when we look at how the body governs our kids? And then how does that, I don't know, sure if you have kids, but how does that govern our responses as parents?
Well, parents are humans too, so we have to
Hmm.
start there. Parents are under states of threat. Parents, in terms of parenting, it's a lot of uncertainty as well. So, being a parent in itself is a lot of threat reactions because you're trying to be helpful. You don't want your child injured, but you want your child to be predictable. It's a complex set of demands on parenting. It's much easier when your children are grown up and successful. Then you can sit back and say, "Wow, what a journey!" But look, they're out of the house some of the time. But the point is that we tend to think of behavior as being intentional. And I think that is really the take home message from polyvagal theory. What about all the behaviors that are being driven by our physiology being in a state of threat? Then we get into the question, what is triggering the threat? So let's separate that we are physiologically a lot of anxious kids, a lot of instances, a lot of depressed children now, a lot of suicidal thoughts. These are these are physiologies that are not safe. So they're not supporting health, growth, and restoration. And we get confused. We start thinking of these as psychological phenomenon, meaning they have no physiological validity. But threat reactions are on mental levels, psychological levels, behavioral levels, and physiological levels. When you're looking at children, highly anxious kids often have a lot of gut problems. Now, what is that all about?
A
Well,
lot of
it's
them,
because
yeah.
a lot of them. And
Yeah.
what it's telling you is really that their nervous system is not safe enough to support these processes that we'll call homeostatic, which are health, growth, and restoration. So being in a threat state, our body shifts priorities rather than taking care of its own organs, healing, growing, digesting food. It's in a state of threat. The analogy is Star Trek, where the Enterprise, the spaceship, has to move its energy from power to do various things or fight or fly to put up defense shields. The defense shields are metabolically costly. They divert the nervous system from its primary goals of health, growth, restoration, and sociality. And this is where the theory starts taking some really deep roots, because we can understand that it's not a bad behavior. It's behavior at the service of survival. So we could call it very adaptive, but functionally it is maladaptive in the local environment. So for some reason, and this is where the clinical history, therapeutic interventions, signals of threat are overwhelming that child's nervous system. And that's this neuroception. So what makes us and other social mammals unique in the whole, family of vertebrate species is that not only can we detect and react to threat with a neuroception of defense and reactivity, like a startle or pain, but we have a newer mammalian circuit. This made the system polyvagal that turns off threat reactions. So our whole nervous system evolved to enable connection and co-regulation with another.
Mhm.
This is this remarkable aspect of signaling another of your species. And we can see this very easily when we have pets. So you have a dog or a cat. How do you talk to your dog or your cat? You use a very prosodic with intonation. Now, the question is, do you talk to your children the same way?
And
Not necessarily,
not
because
if
you
they're
want to, quote, straighten them out. But what about your cat or your dog or your horse? You talk to them, say, pretty baby, lovely this, or,
easy. Yeah.
yeah. And the animal gives up its defenses. And for cats and dogs, often they roll on their back and say, rub my belly. They're showing a very vulnerable ventral side. They're basically connecting and feeling safe with you. But we treat humans not on that level. We say you should be smart enough to understand what I want and what I mean. Uh, so we think it's all about what I say and not how I say it.
Yeah,
So,
that's such a beautiful analogy because people, I mean, I have horses, I have dogs, I have cats. So I get that. When they are in a state of stress, whether I'm training or just like we're
yeah,
hanging around the house, that's very quick. You move towards
yeah,
you. Well, sometimes eye contact might not be appropriate, but you go to the shoulder and you give them a pat and say, easy, easy, or it's okay. And we do that social dance, which is co-regulation and saying, I've got you. It's safe. It's going to be okay.
mm,
I rarely look at my animals and say, this is willfully disobedient. They're like, no, they're scared. Like there's this behavior they're doing because they're stressed. But with
mm,
our kids, we forget
mm,
how underdeveloped the brain is, that when they're in that state of stress, they don't have, while those parts of the brain are developing in our kids, they're very underdeveloped. That
mm.
hardware for logical thought and problem solving and self-regulation, they're not done till close to 30. So we sit there and say my child should be smarter than their feelings, and it's like, well, that's not how this works. Like first we have to take care of the body being safe. They need
Mm.
co-regulation so they can even access those
Yeah.
parts of the brain that could regulate, that could problem solve, that could be logical.
So it's a neuroception of safety, which is part of our evolutionary heritage of calming our bodies down.